Hello and welcome to this video on public expenditure. So in this video we're going to look at the size of the state and compare the size of the state between developing and developed countries and look at some of the reasons behind why we have different sizes of governments between countries. So when we're talking about the size of the state, we're really talking about the extent to which, or the levels at which there are public expenditure within the economy. And public expenditure is money spent by central and local government. And we can normally categorize public expenditure into three main categories. The first type of public expenditure or government spending we call current. And that's day-to-day spending that's required to provide public services, public goods and services. So things like teacher salaries to provide education, nurses and drugs to provide healthcare services. So this current spending that is made on a day-to-day basis to keep public services running. The next type is capital spending. And this is spending on long-term investment plans. So things like building new roads, building new hospitals, building new prisons, new schools, all these other public sector projects. When the government spends money doing this, we would call this capital spending. And the final type is transfer payments. And this is payments from the state to individuals in the form of welfare payments. So things like pensions, things like unemployment benefits. And the key here is this is money that's just transferred. There is no production in return. The other two, the government gets something in return, either the provision of a service or some sort of physical asset. A transfer payment is just made from the state to an individual. So these are the three main types of public expenditure that we have. So now we can start to look at this question. What is the ideal size of the state? Should the government have a very large active role? Should there be a lot of public expenditure? Or should the state actually be quite small and there should be quite low levels of public expenditure? Another way of asking this question is for every dollar, pound or euro spent in a country, how much of that should originate from the government? Now your answer to this question might depend on lots of different things. For example, whether you think private sector businesses are better at providing services than public sector businesses. It might depend on what your view is on tax. How much should tax be? What would you consider a fair rate of tax? What services should the government provide? And who knows what's best for people themselves, the government or the market? What gives us the best outcome? And depending on your personal preference, your ideas about the answer to these questions would give you an indication for your feel of what the size of the state should be. So when we're looking at the size of the state, we're normally looking to measure it by saying what percentage of GDP does government spending account for? So if we look here at the UK and we look at this red line that shows us spending, we can see that approximately on average around about 40% of GDP is the size of government spending. If anything, we would say that there is probably a slight downward trend here over the last 20, 30 years or so. If we look at Denmark and many Scandinavian countries, we typically see much higher values, around 55, sometimes even 60%. So a much larger role for the government in directing economic activity. When we look at some countries, for example here, Zambia, and particularly developing countries, we see that the scale of spending, government spending as the size of the economy, here is ranging around about sort of 16%. So we're talking about nearly a third of the size. The government's involvement is nearly a third of the size as it is in the UK, and even less compared to Scandinavian countries. So this is a really nice chart that shows us government spending as a percentage of GDP. So on the scale at the top here, government spending nearly 60% of GDP, and we look at some of the countries that we would expect to get, we can see that we have Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Scandinavian countries tend to have a very large role for government spending. And then we can see countries like Belgium, Greece, Austria, Italy, the UK. They come in kind of this next tranche down, where we're looking at, around about 50, 45% type range for government spending. At the bottom end, we have quite small governments here, so less than 20% spending for the government in places like the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore. And then we have another group of countries here: Thailand, Venezuela, Chile, China, Mexico, Morocco, those countries. So if we have a look at the color coding of these charts, the system here, what we can see is that the blue countries here are the European countries. So typically in Europe, we have higher, larger government sector, public sector spending. And in Asian countries, down towards the bottom, Asian and African countries, we typically have lower government spending. So how does the size differ? We would say in developed countries, we tend to have a more active role for government, larger government spending, more public expenditure than in developing countries. This list here shows us the governments that just spend the most, really. So we can see a strong correlation between the bigger economies in the world and therefore the amount that they spend as governments. This chart shows us those countries with the biggest deficits in terms of government spending. And this chart shows us those countries that have the biggest surpluses in terms of government spending. So we see a general rule when it comes to the size of the state is that the government accounts for a larger proportion of spending in the economy in developed economies and a smaller proportion in developing economies. And this is linked closely to the work of the economist Rahn, who has developed this idea of the Rahn curve. And on this bottom axis, we have government spending as a percentage of GDP. And on the y-axis here, we have GDP growth. And generally speaking, the theory, he said, there was that as governments get bigger, as governments take a more active role in the economy, this can lead to economic growth. But if governments were to get too big and account for too much economic activity, this can have a negative effect on economic growth. And so the optimum size of government, the optimal size of government can be correlated with the size of government that achieves the fastest rate of GDP growth. So all this begs the question of, well, what influences the level of public expenditure? So some broad theories for us to think about, some broad issues. First of all, the level of development. As we've seen, developed economies tend to have higher government spending than developing economies. There can be an argument that the political ideology of the country, so if it's more perhaps left-wing, more Keynesian, it would advocate a stronger role for government spending. If it was more right-wing, more of a classical point of view, then it would advocate less government spending. We can sometimes see that there's an impacted by the business cycle. So for example, in the 2009 recession, we saw a big increase in government spending across many economies as the governments tried to prop up the economies and deal with rising unemployment. Also, those countries that have ambitious long-term growth plans, we might see more public spending in order to finance those, in order to create the infrastructure to achieve that growth. So why do developed countries have more significant public sector involvement than developing countries? Well, one reason could be the level of GDP. And as GDP rises, incomes rises, and the demand for government-provided services, for example, things like health, education, these are fairly income elastic. So as people get richer, they buy more of these. So therefore, as GDP rises, there is an increased demand for these sorts of services that the government provide, and therefore we see an expansion in public sector provision of these services. Secondly, the age of the population. An aging population, which can also be associated with those populations in developed countries, have increased demand for government services such as healthcare and pensions, and therefore, as a result, those governments have to spend more money. As I mentioned previously, political priorities can have an influence here. and also society's expectations. Over time, with development, people have come to associate certain public services as being a human right rather than an unexpected luxury. For example, access to education, healthcare, a welfare system, and basic infrastructure. And as a result, society therefore expects the government to provide these sorts of services. There might be some other reasons as well as to why we might see a larger government spending in the economy. And one is the redistribution of income. So higher levels of safety net or higher levels of redistributive taxation have led to an increased role in the state. Discretionary fiscal policy, so government investment, can be seen as important in many countries that are trying to achieve economic growth, particularly fast-growing Asian economies. The governments in these countries, so Korea and China and so on, the governments here have taken quite an active role in investing in the economy in order to create economic growth. And lastly is debt interest. If a government has previously got large national debts and they have to pay interest on these debts, that payment of interest does count as a form of public expenditure. So therefore, countries with higher debts will have slightly higher public expenditure as a result. There's a strong link between government spending and productivity. And this is around the idea of human capital, so the value of the productive potential of an individual or a group of workers. Government spending on public goods, or those possessing positive externalities, healthcare, education, training, can boost human capital. And this can drive economic growth in the future. So government can often lay the foundations, the building blocks, education, infrastructure, healthcare, that then go forward to provide the foundations for solid economic growth. However, we can argue, on the contrary, that government spending could just lead to government failure. There might be value for money issues over training or infrastructure, and also what is the quality of the service that's being provided. Another issue with high levels of public expenditure is the phenomenon of crowding out. So if the government increases its spending to stimulate aggregate demand, the size of the private sector could be reduced. There's the idea here that the government crowd out the private sector. So if the government is going to spend more, they might raise taxes, and this makes it harder for private sector investment, and consumption may fall. It may make those firms also less competitive, so effectively the government is crowding out those private sector businesses. Also, if the government is going on a big spending spree and borrowing lots of money, that can mean that there's less finance available for private sector companies to borrow, and so they cannot do their projects, or actually we see that interest rates are driven up in the market from the increased demand for funds from the government, and this makes it harder for firms to borrow, or if they do borrow, then they have to pay higher interest rates. So again, it's crowding out the private sector businesses. And this is a major criticism of the active role of the public sector in the economy. So in this video, we've had a good old discussion here about the size of the state between developing and developed economies, and what the ideal size of the state should be. That's it. Thanks very much for listening.